Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome. Just waiting a few seconds for everyone to join the call before we get started here. But not everyone needs to hear 100% of the preamble, so I will just welcome you all at this point to another online presentation from Biometric Update. We discuss the hot topics and important issues in biometrics and digital identity. I'm your host and the managing editor of Biometric Update, Chris Burt. Fraud attacks against digital payment systems have been increasing in sophistication for years, as I'm sure we are all aware. But the introduction of AI, and generative AI in particular, has altered the fraud landscape. Traditional defenses are no longer adequate, and new tools must be deployed. Biometrics retain a critical role in payment fraud defenses, but that role has also changed and evolved. Here to help us understand those changes, we are very fortunate to have Carmel Marr of Mitek and Alan Goode of Goode Intelligence with us. Carmel is Director of Market Strategy and Intelligence at Mitek, where she leads efforts to align market insights with product innovation and go-to-market strategy. How are you today, Carmel?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much, Chris. Excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, we're very excited to have you here. Mitek is familiar to Biometric Update readers as a global leader in digital identity and fraud prevention solutions based on the latest advancements in computer vision and artificial intelligence. We'll be talking about those very topics as we move along. We also have with us Alan, the CEO and Chief Analyst at Goode Intelligence, which is the biometrics market's leading market analysis and consulting firm. How are you doing today, Alan?
Doing very good. It's nice and sunny here in southern England, so all good. Thanks.
Fantastic to hear that. And I just want to take this opportunity to quickly shout out a liveness market report and buyer's guide that Alan and I worked on together just recently. We're going to be touching on liveness detection and some related concepts, I'm pretty sure, as we go forward today. Before we get right into the discussion, I'd like to touch on a few housekeeping items. We are recording the call, so all of you who are present and any of your colleagues who could not make it today will be getting an email afterwards, and that email will include a link to the recording. We're going to be doing a question and answer session towards the end, so please feel free to offer any questions, comments, etc., using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So let's dive right into things. And Alan, I understand you have some research insights that you can start us off with about payment fraud and how defenses against its more sophisticated forms have been adapting.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm going to spend a little bit of time with you discussing some recent research that we carried out on the use of biometrics for payments. Hopefully, it will set the scene for the rest of today's discussion. We recently published a major market analyst report covering how biometrics is being used to support payments, which is the third edition of our Biometric for Payments study, first published back in 2015. So it's also very interesting to see what's changed in that 10-year period. We focus mainly on consumer payments, but most of the biometric technology referenced in the report can be used to support other areas of payments and banking. So in looking at how biometrics are used for payments, in the report we investigate the adoption of biometric technology in the major parts of the payment process, from onboarding payment customers, from payment transacting, and fraud management. There is an overlap between these processes, and you will have similar biometric functions and technologies being used across these payment parts. For instance, the face or voice biometric that you collected during onboarding can be used to authenticate payments and to verify identity. So really, biometrics are now ubiquitous in all parts of the payment process and are being used to prove a new payment customer's identity when onboarding, to authenticate a payment user for both digital and physical payments, and to approve higher risk, higher value payments using step-up or re-verification, and to monitor potential fraud. To support this end-to-end payment process, banks and payment service providers are adopting different biometric modalities and in different ways. It's probably true to say that the payments industry has gone really on to town in adopting biometric technology. For instance, face liveness and matching for onboarding, mobile fingerprint and face authentication for digital wallets and e-commerce payment authentication, face and palm authentication for physical payment authentication at the physical terminals, server-side mobile face and voice biometrics to support higher risk and higher value payments, and behavioral biometrics to support risk-based orchestration models and fraud management platforms. I'll spend a little time diving into the three main parts to provide a little more clarity about biometric adoption. So if we take onboarding as the first example, it's a critical component of remote customer onboarding for financial services, including payments. Adoption of biometric onboarding services for the payment sector has been strongly driven by a combination of AML and KYC regulation, fraud reduction, and digital transformation programs within financial service providers, pushing onboarding to the home through remote, unattended means. In addition to usable liveness detection, and that is certified to ISO standards, and to accurate matching, it is critical to counteract AI-driven identity attacks, including the ability to detect deepfake attacks and to withstand injection attacks. We forecast that by 2030, there will be over 537 million people worldwide using biometrics purely for onboarding purposes. Next slide, please. That's the figure there. So, payment transacting. Biometrics supports all major types of payment transacting across all channels, both physical and digital. In fact, it's actually enabling payments in new channels, in some of the emerging ones. Consumers are very familiar now with using biometrics to authenticate into banking and payment apps, and for using mobile wallets in physical stores. Typically using platform-based biometrics, but increasingly issuing banks and payment service providers are using the biometric captured during onboarding, and then requesting customers to authenticate and verify payments using the stored biometric. Commonly, this is face or voice, or face and voice. Voice has an advantage for multi-channel payments, in particular when authenticating into call centers, and also emerging channels like in-car payments. A trend that we are seeing is the ability to allow your customers to authorize higher value payments on mobile, largely using server-side biometrics, to server-side face biometrics, but also voice as well. This is important when giving customers choice for authentication methods. Lower value, lower risk payments can use on-device biometrics, but for higher value, higher risk payments, a verified face or voice with liveness detection can provide an extra level of assurance. This model is not just suited for mobile, but can be applied to other payment channels, including physical, leveraging cameras and biometric sensors integrated into POS terminals, and even integrated into cars. What we're seeing also is the ability to support other applications, including age assurance, automatically providing a person's age at the physical point of sale. Next slide on fraud management. With payment fraud levels around the world rising and worrying levels of AI-driven fraud, the ability to detect and prevent fraud is a critical issue. Biometric technology is being leveraged in flexible ways to detect and prevent payment fraud. Behavioral biometrics is being embedded into fraud management and risk-based authentication platforms to both detect legitimate and fraudulent behavior. It has the ability to reduce false positives and can be combined with other biometric modalities and fraud and authentication systems to drive down fraud and improve the user experience. Server-side face biometrics is being adopted to support a number of different applications in payment processing, including step-up authentication, where the risk engine determines greater fraud risk, and device rebinding, where face authentication is used when a new mobile device replaces an enrolled device. And we forecast that by 2030, over 760 million people worldwide will be using biometrics for the prevention and detection of payment fraud. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan. That sets the stage well for us in understanding this issue and how payment systems are dealing with the latest developments in fraud. Very interesting. You note the 760 million overall forecast for 2030. 530 million are expected to be using biometrics for onboarding. That's traditionally where we think about preventing fraud in the biometrics field. So, Carmel, let's start with that account opening process that we're used to talking about in this context, and the new elements in that part of the process. So, deepfakes, synthetic identities. Can you tell us a little bit about their impact on the payment ecosystem so far, and touch on why those legacy security measures are not really measuring up and defending against them?
Absolutely. So the account opening stage is always interesting because it's where you know the least about the individual when they show up. So you also have the opportunity in that stance to ask them the most questions, I would say. But one of the things that we're seeing across every stage of the payment journey right now, from new account creation to transaction authorization, is that sharp increase in sophisticated fraud techniques. These techniques often are harder for criminals, but they're also way harder for vendors and enterprises to catch, including a lot of the types that you just mentioned. So synthetic identity fraud, where a fraudster is using a blend of both real and fake information to create a new identity that doesn't tie back to any one specific individual in order to set up a new account and then use that account to commit payments or other fraudulent activity. A lot of times we're seeing these driven through Gen AI right now, which is why we're seeing such an increase in a lot of that volume. Deepfakes we're familiar with. That's one that's not just impacting us here in the identity space, but we're seeing it in the news and in scam attacks and all over, where we're seeing deepfakes being represented as different people in order to either get access to an account, change account information, transfer funds, or set up a new account pretending to be a different person. And then there's injection attacks, which is often the most difficult to determine, where you're looking at a fraudster that is bypassing those traditional methods. You're actually looking at someone that's able to take that information and inject it behind the scenes in order to set up a new account, access that account, or approve a transaction. And so, as I mentioned, with each stage, we're seeing this go up pretty rapidly. And what we're hearing about it a lot more from our customers. And I think one of the main drivers of this is really that rise in generative AI. So it's dramatically decreased the barrier to entry for a lot of these fraudsters that might not have had the sophisticated tools prior. So a few years ago, your average person, me included, would not have been able to quickly put together a fictitious synthetic that tied to a passport or a driver's license. Having that access to some of those tools, or a convincing deepfake. It would have required a lot more engineering capabilities, coding, those kind of things. But now, with a lot of the templates available, the deepfake tools that you can download, or a plug-and-play fraud kit, it really allows almost anyone to put together a pretty convincing attack, which is very scary. And it makes sense why a lot of we're hearing from our clients that these are things that are concerning them. But I promise my role for the whole webinar isn't just to sit here and bring bad news. These capabilities are also things that we're seeing help the good guys a lot in preventing some of these risks or techniques. So we're seeing that Gen AI, or even some of the patterns that we're using to learn from some of these things, you can see how these tools help to identify new patterns, new anomalies, much faster than we would ever seen before. So it's giving the strength to kind of help defend against some of those fraudsters that we're seeing. But it does at least feel right now that fraudsters they have a bit of the upper hand when it comes to the speed in adapting these technologies.
Okay, so we have a real problem statement, a real challenge to deal with. Before we get into those defenses that you just mentioned a little bit more, Carmel, you have an example. We're looking at one right now. I understand you brought a few examples of just what those fraud capabilities are using the new technology. Can you share a little bit more on that for us?
Yes, absolutely. So I always find it's helpful when you're able to pull together a real life story with some of these things. So the first example I wanted to walk through is one where we're seeing how AI is making fraud a lot easier for some of the fraudsters. So in this example that you're looking at here, the document on the right is a real driver's license and it was stolen. So at this point, you have an actual driver's license with an individual on them. And if you're a fraudster, your problem now with being able to set up a new account or verify is that your face doesn't match that face on the license. What can you do with it at that point? So what we're seeing fraudsters adapt and use at a much higher rate is a face morph. So this individual has gone through the process of saying, okay, well, I have a real license. I know this will pass. How do I match my face to this guy's face so I can set up a new account or whatever it is that he's attempting to do? So he's going through the process of just changing features through a face morph screen where he can get it close enough that it will match. And when you look at this slide, you can see how obvious it is that it's, variations of the same pictures. You see that photo in the background and his chair has, some unique orange characteristic there. But if you're looking at this one-off, say maybe you look at the license in slide 2 or picture 2 or the license in picture 6, whichever ones, you want to look at one, it becomes a little bit harder to tell that this is a face morph. It could be that person's real face. So having these different layers and components available really helps as fraudsters are getting smarter at getting past the barriers that are in front of them. So for example, on this use case or this example that we saw with one of our clients, is that document is real, it would have passed. The face morph allows the biometrics to pass, and he's really there, so the liveness would have passed. But what wouldn't pass is something like the resolution component, the fact that there's manipulation to the actual face and the identity, the fact that you're seeing that resolution dispute would make it so that individual was flagged and wouldn't have been able to open the account or approve the transaction, whatever it is that it may needed to have been. But it starts to get scary when you can kind of start to see okay, we know there's a problem here. How do we get around it? We know there's a problem here. How do we get around it? So we'll talk more about layering as we keep going through, but I do think it's one of those key points of the more sophisticated fraud gets, the more buttoned up the vendors will need to be in making sure no one's able to get through. And I believe I have one more example here of a use case that we saw on the next slide. Perfect. So this one, we're looking at just the scale and the velocity in which we're starting to see some of these attacks take place. So one of the big concerns is that having these tools available means that fraudsters are able to do this much faster. You're seeing it at scale a lot more than we were 5 years ago or 3 years ago, even 2 years ago, really. So here's an example where we saw a template, and we saw this template used across 2 separate large banks in the UK and Spain, so across different countries. And what's likely happening is they are able to download a kit. You get this template of the license, and then you're able to kind of change the details, the face, whatever, to match something that would allow you to pass. So, this is the opposite to me. When I look at the screen, I think I see different faces. These must be different licenses. But in reality, the holograms on all of these are exactly the same. The numbers that are tied to them are all exactly the same. And the solutions are trained to kind of look to see what are the similarities we're seeing across all of these different components to start identifying that. So, again, that's when we're in a silo, it may look real. But for this particular use case as well, this isn't actually a live document. It is a photo. So that's how they're able to kind of go in and tweak some of those capabilities. So having something like liveness included, having pattern detection, those things will help detect this pretty quickly, which is great. And then on the next slide, so what we're seeing here is, as I mentioned, fraudsters aren't typically just using one attack method. They're not trying it, getting shut down, giving up. They're getting very creative and using the tools at their disposal to do multiple kinds of attack techniques, often even just on the same process. And they're getting more and more resources available to them. So what we found is very, very useful with things like deepfakes or injection attacks or anything that's more of an advanced form of these fraud problems is making sure that you have a layered approach that's looking at more than just one solution component.
Absolutely. You can see how you would need a variety of different layers to tackle all of these different types of attacks, all these different attack vectors that you're referring to, Carmel. Interesting to me that you were discussing both the lower barrier to entry for these more sophisticated kind of higher and more advanced attacks, but also the scale item as we see with those driver's licenses. And then the driver's licenses as well, that kind of brings up the potential benefit of having network intelligence, where you can maybe see across, as you mentioned, the different silos and see, oh, well, we've seen this data before, and can maybe associate it with a past incident or something like that. So Carmel, you've that kind of raises some ways that we can improve our selfie match to ID process. And I know you referred to the liveness and injection attack pieces as well. Can you maybe fill that in a bit more for us, just in terms of payment networks and financial institutions need to be doing to actually bring those processes and those defenses up to date with the current attack methods?
Absolutely. And I think when you're looking at some of these current attack methods and what are some of the best ways that you can implement biometrics, it's such a great way to help improve your layering approach, because you can do a lot of layering without adding additional friction to the customer process. So, based off of the image or the voice, you're able to implement things like liveness or resolution components, things like that can help make sure that the person that is there is both present, actually there as a live person, they're the right person, and they're actually a real person. So, there's all of these questions today where even making sure on a webinar like this that Alan is really Alan and Chris is really Chris, those are things that might have sounded silly 5 years ago, but now it could very easily be something where you can easily change some of those components. So looking at a biometric view of something, making sure that they are layered to check all of those boxes. Are they really there in real time? Are they the right person that I think they are? Nothing's been changed to and are they a real person? Do they actually exist in the society today? And I think using that layered approach is really the only way that it's able to keep up with the speed in which fraudsters are kind of transforming.
Interesting. So the biometrics component is itself providing multiple layers. That match is just the initial layer, and then there's the liveness and injection defenses that go along with that. It's very, very interesting. And it occurs to me, Carmel, as you're describing that, the scenario of how do we even know on a call like this that we are all who we claim to be? And Alexei Kitrov, who is Chief Technology and Innovation Officer of Mitek's innovation arm, ID&R&D, actually demonstrated this exact kind of attack on a webinar that we did about a year ago. Alexei showed up, and another Alexei showed up on the call. So if you, for those on the call who maybe want to dig a little bit more into that particular aspect of things, you can find that past webinar in our archives. Yeah, very interesting and alarming stuff, for sure. But I'd like to come back to you, Alan, for a minute here. Carmel's given us an idea of what we can do, how the defenses fit together. But can you go a little bit deeper into the danger of not getting these strong safeguards in place at the start of the process?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's really imperative that organizations know who their customers are. That's number one, especially at the start of their journey when opening up a new account registration. For many organizations, they must use robust onboarding processes that comply with the local anti-money laundering and know your customer legislation. Non-compliance can lead to financial penalties and even custodial sentences for individuals. If an organization has weak defenses at the start of the customer journey, including poor identity verification, then there's a real risk that they could onboard a fraudster that may be using either synthetic or stolen identity credentials. A type of fraud that is estimated to cost businesses around $6 billion is bust-out fraud. And this is a type of credit card fraud where an individual applies for a credit card, establishes a normal usage pattern and solid repayment history, then racks up numerous charges, maxes out the card with no intention of paying the bill. This scheme often involves building a strong credit profile to open multiple accounts and increase credit limits before maxing out cards and disappearing. Bust-out fraud is counteracted by strong ID measures using biometrics to detect imposters and allow legitimate users to open and access their accounts.
It's sounds like a relatively difficult type of fraud to deal with, and the cost is quite alarming, $6 billion. Yeah, so a really good example there of why we need to know our customer from the start. But let's move on to account access then. So we've got some defenses in place, or understand the need for defenses at the beginning. Alan, what would you say is the biggest risk for banks and payment processors on the account access side?
Yeah, I'd say it's got to be account takeover, and there's a lot of stats to kind of to back this up, really. This is a type of cyber attack where a hacker gains unauthorized access to someone's online account. This is typically done using stolen login credentials, such as usernames and passwords and PINs. Once the attacker has access, they can use the account for making unauthorized payments. Fraudsters are targeting vulnerabilities and bypassing conventional security measures like PINs and passwords. And AI-driven fraud is a growing problem here, where fraudsters will use these AI tools. Carmel's alluded to this, and they will help create hard to detect phishing campaigns that can fool even the best trained people. And the financial impact of ATO fraud is significant and rising. Next slide, please. For the UK, and according to CFAS, account takeover cases skyrocketed up 76% in 2024, with over 75 cases reported. Mobile phone accounts were a primary target, making up 48% of this fraud, with the telecom sector recording 105% over a rise in cases of account takeover. Meanwhile, unauthorized SIM swaps increased by a staggering 1,005% in that same period, with almost 3,000 cases reported affecting mobile providers. So yeah, so I think ATO, and it's great having these real live stats from the UK here with CFAS.
Yeah, and it occurs to me, as you give those shocking percentages and then some of the raw numbers, they always say, or I always hear, that these numbers are generally considered to be wildly underreported as well, or at least some of them
absolutely.
are, right?
Absolutely.
So a large risk. Carmel, how can we do better than these traditional account authentication methods that Alan referred to, better in terms of securing our accounts against these kind of attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever we talk about account takeover fraud, it's always the one that feels most personal. It's always seeing those numbers is always a little bit scary. But one of the ways I think that will really helps with account takeover is including that biometric component. It's a low friction, highly secure. And when you think about other ways that enterprises or customers are authenticating themselves to get into their account, things like passwords, devices, PINs, those kind of components, biometrics are the one that are not easily shared or stolen by anyone. You can't use my face if I am not physically there to access something. So it's one that I think is a key component for keeping those accounts secure.
Right, and the presence is of course ensured by liveness detection. But I mean, Carmel, as you mentioned, the biometrics not being susceptible to theft. We hear this objection a lot that, like, I can't change my face, for instance, if a picture of me is stolen. So yeah, can you just dig into that point a little bit? Give us a little bit, maybe also on how people on the call can explain this point to the people they're talking to.
Absolutely, and that's a very good question, because I spent the first part of this talking about how easy it is to now take over someone's face, and while it's probably the most available piece of information about someone out there. You can find my face or my voice pretty easily. In fact, this webinar is being recorded. It'd probably give you a good example of my gestures, face, and things like that. Data. And there's no, if you wanted to, but if maybe that's Alexi's next webinar. But the idea where you're not going to be able to as easily find my passwords or PINs or steal my device physically. But when you're talking about biometric authentication, we're not just looking at that comparison of, do these two look the same, or does that voice sound the same? That's why they're so tricky for the human eye and ear. What we're doing is really storing these in templates as a mathematical representation of that raw image or that raw data. So that way, you're looking to authenticate someone directly, and adding all those additional layers, you can start to tell, okay, well, has this image been changed at all or morphed in any way? And if you go to the next slide, it kind of gives you a nice list of some of the key ways that you can add in those security to make sure that it is, a biometric match. And one of the ways I like to think about it is almost similar to like a DNA match. You're not just looking at two pieces of DNA and saying those look the same. It's that mathematical composition behind the scenes that allow you to truly make sure that it is the right person within a highly secure component. But as we mentioned, it's not just the two pieces, it's the liveness. You have to then, it's not just that they match, then they need to really be there. And even if they're really there, you can make sure that that's not a photo, that's not a recording, that's not a deep fake. You then need to make sure that they're not committing any kind of injection attack. They're not just implementing that behind the scenes and able to bypass it. So you need to look at things like capture evidence mismatch, camera resolution, all of those things that look at a layer deeper of making sure that that actually is secure and that account the person accessing that account is authorized to do so. So a lot of different layers to think through. A lot of times when you say biometrics, you could mean any piece of that scale. And the way that I typically like to think about it, or the analogy I often like to use, is it's very similar to how you would protect a physical house. So, if you have a house and your house has doors and locks, you're kind of meeting that minimum requirement there. And that's great. You're keeping out anyone that's just trying to walk right through the door. But as you want to increase that security, you need to start to make sure all the access points are secure so that individuals that really want to get into your house aren't able to do so. So, you may start with your doors and your locks and then expand it to your windows, or, for any more of some of these advanced capabilities, going to the cyber level of making sure that your smart tools or your internet access, all of those things can be protected too from individuals, not just physically getting in, but, getting access to. So similar to a physical house, depending on how you want to protect some of those components, allows you to kind of have that scale and that level of making sure everything feels and is secure based on the level of threat that you have of concern.
You put those layers together properly, and the picture scraped from a social media site, not useful, does not allow access.
Exactly.
Very good. And that house metaphor is quite interesting as well. So we've talked about account opening and account access. Alan, how about fraud at the actual payment transaction level?
Yeah, and it's good question, Chris. And I think that biometrics really helps strengthen account access. But it can be used in a variety of ways, and even with traditional authentication, to further secure high-risk transactions while keeping the customer experience as convenient as possible, really. Biometrics has become, and this is the difference between when we first launched this report back in 2015, it's become the dominant force for customer authentication now, for both online and in-store payments. And there are a variety of ways in which this is supported. Mobile POS integrated and even biometric payment cards are all being used to replace cumbersome and insecure passwords and PINs. Biometrics are more secure and more convenient to support step-up authentication when needed, and this is supported with EMV codes, 3D secure, and for use to comply with the EU's Strong Customer Authentication (SCA). And with the growth of digital payment and digital identity wallets, biometrics can also be used to secure these wallets. And it's a great way to keep payments safe, even if your phone is stolen and compromised, providing a higher assurance authorization.
So you can protect the wallet that the payment is made from. You can perform step up if necessary. So we're going to be using biometrics more and more, it sounds like. But what about when the right person has trouble completing their biometric check? Bad lighting, for instance. What should happen there?
Yeah, and I think it's a case. You talk about layering. I think there are two things to discuss here that are important. Mobile biometric technology is constantly improving, especially those systems that are server-side and easier to update and train. They are now better equipped to work in challenging conditions such as low-light scenarios. And additionally, and this is where layered approaches are important, you can give the user choice and provide them with an alternative when a primary authenticator, the primary modality, may be struggling, having problems. Voice is one biometric modality that can be used in these situations. And I believe that Mitek's biometric authentication offers both face and voice authentication, which can be used in combination or independent.
Very good. And Alan, I understand you also have talking a lot about authentication now, but you've done a fair bit of research on the adoption of biometrics specifically for password replacement as well. Can you just touch on that for us?
Yeah, most definitely. Within the payments report, we include password replacement, and we forecast that by 2030, over 3.5 billion people will be using biometrics worldwide to protect their payments, and that includes scenarios including password replacement. I believe that Carmel has some insight from her customers that may be useful for this discussion.
Yeah, so we have started to hear more and more of our customers getting traction with password replacement, especially over the last year or so. But where I think that's really being driven is from some of the willingness from customers. So, there's always going to be some customers that remain hesitant or like to do the same routines, but we're seeing that surveyed customers are becoming more and more concerned with their information being accounts or information being stolen. So they actually somewhat preferred these higher security checks when they're doing higher risk things, large transfers, new accounts, in order to feel like they're being kept safer. It's not something that could easily be taken over. And the other piece of this, I think that it's very helpful is, it's able to be done in kind of real time. You're able to kind of get that feedback immediately. So customers are able to escalate or add in a different layer depending on what risk tolerance they have. So as Alan mentioned, maybe they want to do face and voice, or maybe they need to do a full verification check again, depending on what it is that is occurring. But we have started to see a move towards biometrics and away from some of the strictly relying on passwords.
Finally, right?
Yeah, it took a while.
And the process is still ongoing, I'm sure, but that's good news, right? That's a movement in the right direction from a security perspective, right? So we've got a few questions coming in now, and so I would like to turn momentarily to audience Q&A. But before we do, Carmel, can you maybe just take a couple of minutes and talk to us about how Mitek can help anyone joining us on the call who's looking to strengthen their verification and authentication systems, and in particular to address those AI threats that we've been talking about?
Absolutely. And so what I think is so important as vendors or enterprises are trying to solve some of these difficult problems is working with vendors that are able to really partner on this problem. It's a big problem. It's a challenging problem. And Mitek has spent a lot of time researching, innovating, and working with customers to solve these evolving problems. So one of the things that we keep hearing from clients that are experiencing these problems with especially deepfake and injection attacks is, we know it's happening. We're not exactly sure how much or how often. And if you can't define and quantify the problem, it's always hard to put resources and then measure the progress of it. So one of the things that Mitek has been doing, has had a lot of success in lately, is working with our Purple team, which is kind of a concept driven more from the cyberspace, but allowing teams to kind of go in and say, okay, first let's identify the weaknesses, like what a red team would do, and now let's figure out how we would solve it, like a blue team. So we're calling it the Purple team, and it's been helpful in order for us to get a better understanding around exactly how and when fraudsters are using these techniques, and for our clients to kind of get a better understanding of how they can solve for them. So what I would recommend, with Mitek, we've been the experts in biometric for a long time. We've worked very closely with our face and our voice and our liveness and these advanced techniques. But looking at both what the problems are today and then studying and really putting the time into research where the problems are going and how these threats are emerging at the speed of which we're seeing these things take place, I think is really the key way in which enterprises are going to help, keep up and stay ahead of some of these high risks.
Very good, very good. Well, it's the need is quite clear here. So On that note, I would like to turn to some questions from the audience. Thank you to those who have submitted questions. We've had a bunch just race in here in the last few minutes. So let's start with a question on face velocity and ring attack checks. Carmel, can you tell us what these things are?
I can. So actually, it might be helpful to go back to the slide where we looked at the velocity component. So, Mitek, we have our biometric capabilities and we have our document verification. So that's okay. What we're seeing a lot of times when we're looking at documents is that sometimes we'll see individuals purchase one document and we'll start to see that document hit at a very high velocity. So when you're able to detect those patterns, you're seeing kind of those velocity face checks. So for example, maybe it's harder to create a face from nowhere. So if I want to create 15 different identities, but I use my face on the same one, we start to pick up that I am not 15 different people because there's only one pinned identity face to it. So we actually see that pattern happen a fair amount, especially when we're looking at that document component. And then the other piece of it with a ring attack, somewhat similar, but instead of using typically one face or one person image to create many identities, here you're seeing a group of people that have kind of come together in order to keep any one velocity check on a PII element low enough to keep passing security checks. So sometimes we'll see this where in a similar geographic region, 5 or 10 people get together and they'll send things to different addresses, or they'll use slightly different addresses and a mismatch of different PII elements. So they don't hit any one velocity check component and they can kind of keep that going. And typically we see those as ring attacks, or, you're sharing different documents among different people and you start to pick up on patterns, but it's a lot harder when they're spread out. So those ones I would say from a document or a template are always some of the more challenging ones to assess. And you really have to have a good view of where that individual is operating to catch them. But that is what we mean by when we're talking about face velocity attacks or a ring attack in the space.
Techniques for leveraging the AI while avoiding defenses or legacy defenses, at least.
Exactly, and things that are built into the solution, so we can see and detect if we're seeing that same face come up with different combinations of names and addresses or state licenses, those kind of things. So it's things that we're looking for within our solution to help prevent those kind of things from happening.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Carmel. And there's another question here about what about voice deepfakes and authentication? So we talked about deepfakes mostly so far in the context of face swaps, morphing, stuff like that. Carmel, can you go into the voice side of things a little bit?
Absolutely. And so for the voice, it's very similar to how I describe the face. I think that when I think deepfake these days, I automatically go to face. But you're right, that voice is often one of the ways that we're seeing these things emerge, especially kind of in that scam market. But it's a very similar process in what we're seeing and storing. So we want to look at that individual in a similar mathematical representation, not a raw audio file, but the actual full kind of component of, is this voice authentically that person, and is it live? Liveness for voice, I think, is probably almost even more important than liveness for face, because you can't see them. You don't get any kind of weird lag, or you can't touch your nose. Sometimes, you might be listening, or if I went off video and it may sound a lot like me, it's harder to pick up on those. So having a liveness check with your audio comparison, I think is very, very important. And same with the additional layers with some of those advanced securities. You can still inject a voice, to pass behind the microphone, those kind of things. So making sure that, the capture doesn't mismatch, any kind of liveness component wouldn't actually be there. Those are all still just as crucial for voice as they are for face.
So yeah, a lot of common ground there, right, between voice and face. Alan, do you have anything to add on the voice piece of that?
No, I think Carmel has really covered that.
Okay, perfect. Well then, moving right along, and actually I should mention at this point, first of all, thank everyone again for submitting questions. It's really great. We're getting a lot of good questions here. That voice question, an excellent example of a good question. We're probably going to have too many to get to them all today, but Mitek will follow up, I am told, with those of you whose questions we can't get to. So on that note, let's move right along. We've got one here. Is it more secure to store biometrics in a server rather than in the mobile phone? So a classic security and biometrics question here. Carmel, why don't you start us off on that one as well?
Perfect. Yeah. So it's always safer to have, your verification spread out. If you're able to look at biometrics that are stored, separately than your phone, it gives that extra layer of security. So if I were to use my phone, if you think about it, what happens when your Face ID fails via phone? They ask you to enter your PIN. So at that case, if you can watch someone type in their PIN or it's almost like a great idea in theory, and there is a lot of additional security there, but it kind of falls back onto an older security method that's a little bit easier to bypass. So always safer to have it stored separately.
Alan, you want to chime in there as well?
Yeah, it's just on the verification. Obviously with device-based biometrics, they're really unverified. You can, and if a device gets stolen, as Carmel says, there are ways to brute force phones and to get access to them. So there is a possibility that you can change the biometric that is stolen. I think from a storage perspective, because we use secure hardware and cryptography, yeah, that's pretty secure. But I think it's the other methods for getting access to that device and changing the stored biometric.
A binding issue.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Good one. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question here about what extra layers should be used. Extra layers of behavioral analytics from the client data, for example, pulled from the phone. Yeah, can you comment on that for us, maybe, Carmel?
Sure. So again, as we kind of highlighted throughout, layering is key, and I think that making sure that we know both from a biometric capability stance, what are the different layers that we're able to determine and detect this more strength of your security system. So including things like duplicate frames, including things like digital watermarks or image resolution, I think are key to get through that specific layer of the injection attacks or the deepfakes, those high-level threats. That's it. I think that, whenever you're looking at different signals for identity, layering is always key. And we've seen a lot of more with behavioral biometrics lately, because like we've talked about, the volume is so much higher that you start to get into the weeding out stage of, is it real or is it not real? So you can start there, and then to the advanced layer of, okay, well, do we think that this was injected or not injected? There's all sorts of questions that we now have that list keeps growing. So the additional signals, I think, are those are some of the key ones I think that we would want to focus on.
Yeah, Alan, any insights from your research about sort of the commonality of this, or the what a popular approach maybe is?
I think layering is the answer. I think you can't rely on a single factor, a single authenticator, or a single solution. And this is where kind of like plugging into the risk engine, the risk-based authentication solution. It's important to do that so that you can ascertain what the level of risk is and what level of authentication verification you need. So yeah, I think a reliance on a single factor is always a risky solution.
So it sounds really like any opportunity that a payment processor or financial services company has to leverage some data, that gives them any insight into the behavior of the customer, they should at least be considering whether that's something they should be building into their calculations, right? Let's do at least one more here. We've got a question about how strong are biometric step-ups combined with passkeys, and are there any obvious vulnerabilities to worry about there? Passkeys have obviously been a very very popular choice for passwordless authentication lately, growing very quickly. Carmel, do you have any thoughts about combining step-up and passkeys?
Yeah, I think that step-up and passkeys are a good way to add additional layers. I would say biometrics are more secure in that, you can hack through a passkey or get that even though the passkey it's stored, you can still find the individual password. So it still has that little bit of stolen shared risk that we're seeing a little bit or less or not as much here with the biometric component. You're not able to share or send it quite as easily. But I think too, when we're talking about step up, it's always relevant of what level of step up. How risky is it? Is it something where, you're taking over an account or changing the access points where someone may be locked out for a significant amount of time? Or is it something, you've just changed a smaller lower risk piece of information? So I think that combining with passkeys without any direct vulnerability, but there is that still risk of being able to share or steal that kind of information.
Okay, yeah, Alan, anything to add in terms of biometric step up, passkeys, and or the combination of the two?
Yeah, I think it may be two distinct processes here. You may use passkeys 504, initial initial but then again, going back to that kind of risk-based approach, if it feels a little bit riskier, then you can step up with perhaps a kind of a server-side biometric for that re-verification. So yeah, you can definitely, it depends on that, how to kind of integrate into that workflow really, and what the level of risk is for the particular issuing bank or payment service provider. But it's I think in combination, yeah, it's a definite solution. I can't see, off the top of my head, any obvious vulnerabilities depending on implementation, etc.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Let's do one more before we wrap it. We've got a question here about whether the use of AI agent biometrics authentication has been considered, agent-to-agent communication via natural language, so that humans are involved. Yeah, so let's start with has biometrics been considered in combination with AI agents? Or maybe we can even broaden it out a little bit more to say, Carmel, how do you think the process is influenced, the payment process is influenced by AI agents?
Yeah, and I know it's been a big topic lately of, how are you able to ensure that, if you use AI agents, how do you kind of cut back on some of those costs and better pick up some of those trends and patterns? So I think it's one that's, we're seeing implemented or tested. I would say we're starting to see it tested a lot. We're starting to see, where people able to see success and where are we kind of still seeing some of those vulnerabilities. And, not as a new concept, like with anything that we're training or teaching, there's always some kind of gaps or those knowledge base where something, if you're able to find the system, you can kind of start to exploit it. So I think that it's a strong testing phase now. But, the example I always think of is, if you train a model of dog versus wolf, but all the pictures of a wolf have snow, then you start to see, if you put a snowy picture of a dog, it's going to say wolf. It's not, you don't have that one human layer behind it that helps you kind of check some of those levels. So yes, I think it's a great option in order to increase some of those things that might be hard to see from the human eye. But I also think that we're still kind of figuring out some of those nuances when we go through that process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. And yeah, Alan, do you want to chime in on AI agents before we wrap it up?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area and something that we're looking into at the moment. And yeah, for payments, it's if, for instance, an example could be, travel. So you could say to your AI agent, right, I want to go to southern Spain in August between this time. I want a hotel with these characteristics, etc. Go and find it, and if you find it, let me know, and then you can pay for it. So that's definitely a different model for payments, and it's a case of when you look at the workflow for that, where you stick in the risk control, where you stick in authentication, the actual human and it still will be, I think, for that payment, you still got to ask me whether I approve this transaction. So I think it then comes back to yeah, this is me. I'll put the phone up and it's my face and I can authenticate that. So different models, but I think it's a case of, and I'm sure we'll see a whole lot of different new kind of risk scenarios for this, but it's definitely a fascinating area and something where biometrics can definitely get involved in.
Absolutely. So yeah, yet more complexity being introduced into the payment ecosystem, but at the same time, the sounds like the fundamentals basically remain the same.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think we're coming up to the hour here, and I think we better wrap it there. I apologize to those whose questions we could not get to, but Mitek will be in touch. And I should also mention at this point that with the email that everyone registered, all of you listening along and watching along will receive, you will get not only a link to the recording of this presentation, but also a link to Mitek's white paper on this topic. And so you can continue to educate yourself and better protect your system against these sophisticated fraud attacks. So thank you very much, Alan, and thank you very much, Carmel, for joining us today and talking about this topic.
So much.
Thanks, Chris.
We will be back again soon. In fact, Alan and I will be back tomorrow to talk about our market report and buyer's guide on the UK biometric age assurance market. So please join us for that tomorrow. Please reach out to Mitek to discuss protecting your payment system against sophisticated fraud attacks. And we will return soon to talk more about biometrics and digital identity. Thank you and have a good day.
Oh.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.